Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Eric Ward, and I am Executive Director of Western State Center and a big fan of Integrity First for America. While we approach January 6th and the attempted political attack and physical attack on American democracy, many of us know that the insurrection that the nation witnessed on January 6th did not begin on January 6th. It began months, years, and decades before in places around the country. The second truth that we understand as we gather this evening, on the eve of January 6th, the one-year anniversary, is that the insurrection that took place on that day, the attempt to overthrow American democracy, also did not end on January 6th. It continues in communities around the country where elected officials, health workers, educators find themselves under attack by conspiracies, physical threats, and assaults on civil society. While we have a long road ahead of us, and many will reflect on January 6th tomorrow and the damage that was done to American democracy, I'm delighted to be here with my friends at Integrity First for America to reflect on where we have been, but to also celebrate the resistance of individuals, communities, and organizations like Integrity First for America. None of us should forget that the violence that symbolizes January 6th is also a story of resistance. Individuals, communities, and organizations who have chosen to stand beside one another to bring new tools by taking courageous risks. Integrity First for America is such an organization. So are those who they represented in an important historic case that we will talk about tonight, Sines versus Kessler. I, as an organizer here in the Pacific Northwest, who work with communities, government workers, and individuals each and every day, have understood that one of the challenges over the last 4 years has been the inability of government and civil society to place their hands on tools that hold accountable those who seek political violence. We witnessed that violence on the streets of Charlottesville in the summer of 2017, where Heather Heyer was murdered by alt-right activists, and where many were injured, where the community was terrorized for days by white nationalists and those involved in their larger alt-right coalition. Many of us understood in that day that this simply wasn't about Charlottesville, that this was a signal around the challenges that our country would face. But it was Integrity First for America who stepped up to provide tools. The case in Charlottesville has reverberations around the country. The success of the trial, the historic nature of this lawsuit now places tools in the hands of prosecutors, of civil society, of businesses, and community leaders around the country. You see, the importance of Charlottesville was not only bringing justice to the victims in the community, but to signal to all of us around the country that we are not powerless in this moment. If we only talk about January 6th in terms of a handful of people who tried to spark fear, if we talk about the last 4 years only in terms of those who created destruction, we miss the story of the great majority of Americans who stood up for hope. We at Western State Center are proud to be partners with Integrity First for America. We believe that they are a quintessential part of the solution in how we continue the work for democracy and how we defend democracy from the rise of authoritarianism. That is why I'm pleased to be part of this program today. I'm proud to be with all of you as we not only mourn what occurred over the last 4 years, what occurred a year ago in the nation's capital, but that we celebrate our resilience. I'm excited to hand this evening over to Dahlia Lithwick, who is the senior editor of Slate, to moderate the rest of the program, with Amy Spitalnek, executive director of Integrity First for America, Roberta Kaplan and Karen Dunn, who are the co-lead counsels for this landmark case. Dahlia, welcome, and Amy, Karen, and Roberta, my respect and thanks to you for opening up a path, for showing that there is accountability in this moment, for facing the fear and the threats over the years as you brought justice to the victims and to the rest of America. It should be a model for how all of us act in our own leadership in the path forward over the next years. It's a pleasure to be with you. And Western State Center always will count itself as a supporter of your work and your vision. Dahlia, I'll turn it back to you.
Eric, thank you so much. And I'm gonna ask the panelists to start their videos. Apparently my video cannot be started. Yeah, I'm getting and I can't start my, there you go. Okay. Hi, friends. And Eric, thank you. That was just the absolute perfect framing for the conversation we're gonna have. And I think it's really, really important and useful before we begin to talk to just recognize a win when we see one. It's so easy here on this anniversary of January 6th to feel that nothing can be done, nothing changes. We're in what my kids called crappy Groundhog Day, where every day is kind of the same except fractionally worse, except that's not true, because we're here to celebrate a really epic, historic victory over nihilism, over the sense that nothing can change. And so it is just a profound honor, Eric, to hear your words and to be allowed to moderate this panel of heroes and real, fighters and patriots who absolutely don't believe that it's crappy Groundhog Day in America. So I want to start by asking you, Amy, if you would, to just really briefly, because I think folks know the story of Charlottesville, but tell us a little bit about that kind of moment in time that summer in 2017. It's all anybody talked about, but it seems like it's 1,000 years and 7 tragedies ago. So maybe you could set the table about what the events were, and then we will pivot to the lawsuit.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Dahlia, for moderating this and for I think just your tireless work in covering not just the trial, but these issues more broadly, and Eric, for your partnership and all of your leadership on this topic. It's just, we are so lucky to be with, I think, 2 of my really favorite people that I get to work with tonight, in addition to, of course, our incredible lead counsels, Robbie and Karen. So there's a lot to celebrate, and I'm so glad to do it with this group. Look, I think I don't need to rehash everything that happened in that summer of 2017, but it's particularly as we prepare to mark January 6th, noteworthy how much of a harbinger Charlottesville and Unite the Right ultimately were when it came to the cycle of extremism that's followed. The tools, the tactics, the ideology, even as some of it's evolved and metastasized and grown over the last 4 years, the echoes of Unite the Right and of that cycle of white supremacist extremism, of course, are still central to the domestic extremism that we're seeing at record levels today that Eric alluded to, not just happening at the seat of our government, but certainly also in school board meetings, public health meetings, election meetings around this country. And a lot of what we saw that weekend in August 2017, sadly, really previewed that. First, of course, we know how that weekend was not the first attack on Charlottesville that summer, but really the culmination of a number of different white supremacist rallies. Certainly this one turned violent, as was always intended to be the case, as we'll talk about tonight, and as we proved at trial. And that included both the Friday night Tiki Torch March, in which University of Virginia students were surrounded at the Thomas Jefferson statue by torch-wielding Nazis who chanted vile anti-Semitic racist slogans and threw fuel and lit torches at them, punched, beat them up. And then, of course, the next day, which culminated in the car attack that killed Heather Heyer and injured so many, including a number of our plaintiffs, but truly was fully a full day of violence in which people were beaten and harassed across this downtown Charlottesville simply for standing up for their community and speaking out against the white supremacists who descended on their town. And so what our lawsuit alleged and what was really proven at trial is that this violence was no accident, that it was planned meticulously in advance in social media and a variety of other communications platforms and even in in-person meetings. And that evidence that came out over the course of the trial, is for many of you who have been following it, I'm sure was stunning, even if you followed this lawsuit for 4 years. The level of planning, the level of hate that went into it was truly remarkable. And it became all the more important because of just how well, sadly well, it previewed the violence that followed over the subsequent years.
Robbie, first of all, I'm gonna say the thing I should have said up top when I was trying to get my camera to work, which is the format here this evening is we're gonna talk amongst ourselves for about 25 more minutes, and then we will take your questions starting, in about that. And so pop them in the Q&A and we will try to get to as many of them as we possibly can. And I'm going to try to ask the big sort of framing questions and you all will be my minders, and anything I forget to ask, you'll pop in the chat. Robbie, I want to turn to you and ask, something that was just threaded through both what Eric said and what Amy said is that everything always looks random until there's a pattern. One of the things I think that is hard to recapture in hindsight is that there were patterns here. There was a plan here. There were themes here. And by the way, they're some of the same themes we're seeing playing out in the discourse around January 6th. And I wonder if what you can do for us, just by way of setting the table, is help us understand that in the days and hours after the events of August 2017, when it just looked to the world like maybe a whole bunch of Nazis and alt-right and white supremacists decided to go to a town and things got out of hand, that in fact, that is not true, that there was a pattern there that is very much of a piece with other patterns that we saw both before and after. And then how you and Karen and your team crafted the lawsuit to tease out what those patterns and themes are. So that's a very broad question, but I know you can do it.
I'll do my best, Dahlia. So look, Dahlia, as per usual, is exactly right. When Americans like me, and many of you, I'm sure, were watching the horror of what happened in Charlottesville in August 2017 on your TV screens, it appeared to many, and frankly, until we got into this, to me as well, as kind of random riot, street violence happening on the streets of Charlottesville, and not part of a broader, carefully planned, carefully orchestrated conspiracy for exactly that kind of violence to happen. In the law, another word for pattern is a conspiracy, or at least in this context, another word for pattern is conspiracy. So all that I knew when I first saw the violence on TV is that something needed to be done about it. What happened as Karen and I start to work on the case is, and in part because of a release of some of the Discord chats that the defendants in our case used, although by the time we got to trial, we had a lot more, much greater record, is that there was nothing other than the tragedy that it was Heather Heyer who was killed when the car ran into her, and that was random in that sense. There was nothing really about what happened in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th that was random. The defendants for many, many weeks, I would say months leading up to it, planned for what Karen loves to call, and she's absolutely right, the Battle of Charlottesville to happen. They patterned that battle on other battles that had happened in Berkeley, California, where one of the defendants in our case infamously punched a woman in the face, and that became a rallying cry among white supremacists. They knew how to rally the troops to get there, how to motivate their soldiers from all over the country to come, both in terms of the practicalities of arriving in Charlottesville and in terms of what would motivate them. And sadly, what would motivate them was basically hatred of racial, religious, and ethnic minorities, primarily Black people and Jews. And then when they got there, to organize things. Friday night was very heavily planned to be kind of the prelude to Saturday. It was a hidden, secret, violent march with tiki torches to invoke the Nazis and the KKK in the most hallowed parts of the UVA campus, walking through areas where students, including one of the students who testified at trial, lived, literally feet away from her doorstep. And then the violence that happened on Saturday, again, was planned. They wanted, there's a lot of talk at our trial, there's a lot of talk today, there's a lot of talk about January 6th, about this thing, Antifa. We could have a whole long discussion about that, but suffice it to say that at Charlottesville, they wanted something that they could call Antifa to be there so that they could justify the violence that they used. They wanted, they practically sent a personally engraved invitation to whoever people are, like Antifa or whoever they are, to come to Charlottesville so that that could then be used as an excuse, which it was, for committing violence, supposedly in the name of self-defense, but not really in the name of self-defense. And that pattern, that precise pattern of using social media nationwide, inciting people based on racial, religious hatreds or hatred of democracy, frankly, provoking that violence in the name of so-called defense against Antifa. That pattern, we saw it in Charlottesville, and then we saw it for the next 4 years, sadly, in so many of the rallies about Black Lives Matter, about other incidents, and then culminating with very much those very same features happening on January 6th. So, you know, it looked like random violence. It wasn't random violence, it was planned violence. And that's exactly what our whole trial was about.
And Karen, can I ask you to just briefly lay out, you know, in some sense, it was a gap-filling trial, right? And I think that's the thing that's complicated, is we already had, you know, the person who hit Heather Heyer with a car was already tried. You know, there had been sort of bits and pieces of attempts at accountability. This was an effort to do, I think you would say, what a functioning Justice Department would have done in the, you know, circumstances. Can you just explain what this like big sweeping theory, the legal theory was, that was going to kind of sweep in every one of these defendants, all of these plaintiffs, and be a kind of a really historic inflection point, because this couldn't work doing it piecemeal?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Dahlia. And first of all, I can't thank Eric enough for that introduction. I mean, you gave voice to things that we all think and feel. And obviously, tremendous thanks to Amy and the whole IFA team. We've been at this together for a long time, so we're very grateful. You know, so as Robbie said, this is a conspiracy case, and the law of conspiracy, which is used in courtrooms across America every day, certainly in criminal cases. Most people are familiar with the idea of a drug conspiracy, where you have people at every rung. You have like sort of the street level people, but then you can work your way up to hold accountable the big fish, the big bosses, and the people who are really organizing and sending the foot soldiers out into the field. So what we did was construct a case that was a conspiracy case. And in doing that, we were able to bring in the people who were not necessarily the most violent foot soldiers like James Fields, but instead the people who inspired James Fields, who created the atmosphere and the context and gave James Fields all the tools he needed to drive a car through people, all the groups that came together. So we really sued the entire leadership of the white supremacist movement who had worked together, and they all, we connected everybody up in this trial. I mean, that is the key with the conspiracy case. You have to connect everybody up. But I think the key thing as we look ahead to other cases, and I think, some of the January 6th litigation has been modeled on our case, and similarly, our conspiracy cases, what people who are even thinking about going to these violent events and doing these things have to understand is how easy it is to be part of a conspiracy. You can be part of a conspiracy if you go to one event, if you join at any time, if you participate even in a way that's not an express agreement, if it's an implied agreement to a conspiracy. Your mere presence at the event sometimes can be a basis for a finding of conspiracy, both civilly and criminally. So the law of conspiracy is very, very powerful in holding the people accountable who are responsible. The other point I want to make, which is not directly responsive to your question, but picks up on something that I think you're saying and that Eric certainly said, is we would be making an enormous mistake, not just as lawyers but as Americans and as people who care about our institutions and our democracy, to look at any of these things in isolation, and that includes our trial. So one thing we learned at this trial is that the Battle of Berkeley took place on April 15th of 2017, and it was incredibly violent on the streets of an American city viewed to be a pretty progressive city. And after that, Richard Spencer, the head of the alt-right, very powerful political leader at the time, one of our defendants, said on a radio interview that this heralded a new era of political violence and nothing is ever going to be the same. And that was the model for the Battle of Charlottesville, that this would be a new era of political violence. And as we sit here on the anniversary of January 6th, on the eve of that, we saw the new era of political violence and what it had become. And, I was shocked to read, this poll that came out by the Washington Post the other day that said 1/3 of Americans believes that political violence is sometimes warranted. And just in case you think that that is a number that isn't extraordinary, 10 years ago, the number was half that. So our case, what was an extremely important case on its own, but as we looked at the evidence very closely and we saw where it fit in the trajectory of what's been going on in America, we might have been the least surprised people on January 6th, unfortunately. This is a real phenomenon. And the main message of our case is pay attention. This is not, none of it's an accident. And, truly, if this can be Berkeley, it can be a college town like Charlottesville, it can be the United States Capitol. We all need to pay very close attention to what's happening here.
It's such an important point, Karen, because I think we can get really myopic and think that Charlottesville was about Charlottesville and, the world has moved on. In many ways, I think what you're saying is the world has moved on to darker and worse places because of Charlottesville, because there was no accountability, and that was sort of unrolling a roadmap that needed to be arrested. And I love that framing. I hadn't heard you say it that way before, but I think it's really vital to understand that it's not just a diagnosis. These are two episodes of a similar problem. It's actually the cure. And I wonder if I can ask each of the three of you, this was a huge judgment. It was a 4-year effort to bring this case to trial. It was a month-long trial in COVID. What surprised you? I mean, what did you learn in that month of the trial that you, having seen all the documents and understood the conspiracy and steeped yourself in the story of how Charlottesville unrolled, what did you come out of trial saying, oh, wow, I didn't expect that? And maybe we can start with you, Amy.
There's so much. And I think even for, I imagine, the four of us and many others on this call who had been steeped in not just what happened 4 years ago, but the broader issues of extremism in America, there were still many moments of horror and shock throughout the trial. And I think the fact that the defendants felt so comfortable being so flagrant in their extremism, they were making Holocaust jokes on the stand. They were using the N-word in their opening statements. And that was as part of a very deliberate strategy to desensitize the jury and in some ways desensitize the world to this extremism as it becomes increasingly prevalent. And that's not an accident. We're witnessing a moment where extremism has become increasingly normalized in this country. That's what January 6th was. And that's what all of these more subtle but equally dangerous attacks on our officials, our government, and our democracy are. And so when you see that play out in the courtroom through just the flagrant use of racial slurs and anti-Semitism and full-on extremism in a way that is at odds with every societal and democratic norm we all hold dear, it's both shocking, but also a perfect illustration of what's at stake here and why it's so crucially important to hold these extremists accountable as this case did.
How about you, Robbie? What surprised you? And I think of you as somebody who's not really got a huge capacity for surprise, but what, after sitting day after day after day in that courtroom with those folks, did you learn from the evidence, the witnesses, as it played out in front of you? You're muted.
Thing that has really, and it's in keeping with what everyone else has said already, but one of the things that really has sadly grown and expanded since Charlottesville, and you see it today, and we certainly had a lot of it at the trial, as you just heard Amy talk about, is these not only extremist beliefs, but crazy, I don't know what other way to put it, crazy theories about reality and about how the world works. And in particular at Charlottesville, it was really focused on, and Eric has written so much about this and really shed so much light on it, something known as replacement theory, which is this idea that basically all the progress that has been made in this country for civil rights for Black people, for civil rights for LGBT people, for civil rights for women, you could go on, all of that didn't happen on its own. Those groups were not capable of bringing about that kind of change on their own, that they needed the help of a conspiratorial, wily, clever, powerful, though small in number, group that was kind of the puppet masters that would enable them to do that. And that group, many of you have probably guessed by the time I got there, is the Jews. And so these people, in the case, the defendants who we were in the courtroom with, at least two of them almost every single day, truly believe in their hearts that there is a group of Jews, or some subset of Jews out there, that George Soros being a prominent member, the Rothschild family being another member, certainly Amy, Karen, Robbie Kaplan being other members, whose job it is to evilly manipulate our society to help the Jews at the expense of everyone else, and to replace, that's where replacement comes in, white Anglo-Saxon men from their kind of prior standing in American society. I knew that going in. I knew that was their theory. I'd been spending 4 years steeped in it. But even and as you said, Dahlia, you're absolutely right. I'm someone who's not used to being surprised. Even I, with my relatively thick skin, was shocked at the degree to which they just accept this. So for example, I have never in my entire life heard more people expressing admiration for Mein Kampf in one place as I did in this trial. And again, it's genuine. They all talked about Mein Kampf being this incredibly important book that was had a huge influence on them and was incredibly brilliant. And then when we cross-examined them on it and said, well, with Mein Kampf, like you said, you just like the social part of Mein Kampf. So you weren't into the Jew killing part of Mein Kampf. They would try to distance themselves, but Jew killing is what Mein Kampf is all about, as Deborah Lipstadt testified at trial. And so I think I was most shocked, and it happened the very first conference we had right when we got to Charlottesville, one of the lawyers who actually was born Jewish stood up and said that he was on the other side, of course, that he was very tired of hearing Jews who only want to talk about the Holocaust. And that enough in his mind with all these Jews who all they do is whine and fetch about the Holocaust. And he didn't think there should be any reference, the judge should preclude us from having any reference to the Holocaust at trial. And just like I rarely surprise, I do have a tendency to get, how shall I put it, passionate about things. So as I was listening to this, I remember saying to myself, Robbie, just keep your cool, keep your cool, keep your cool. And when he finished speaking, I stood up and I said, Your Honor, we don't have to use the word the Holocaust. We can use the defendant's words. You know, they talked about gassing the kikes, ovening the kikes, and genociding the kikes literally all the time. And so that's what we intend to show at trial, not we don't have to characterize it. They said it in their own words. I don't think there was a day of trial where the word kike didn't come up a half a dozen times. And so as much as Karen and I fought, and ultimately I think the verdict showed that the jury was not completely desensitized to this, I have to admit that in some respect it became normalized because it was the normal everyday discourse at the trial. And that shocked me. I had never been in that kind of environment before. That was very long-winded. I hope that makes sense.
No, we're all just absorbing it. It's a lot. Karen, how about you? Something that you learned over the course of trial that your 4 years preparation didn't prepare you for?
Yeah, so I was going to say one thing similar to what Robbie said and one thing different, but I do think the effect of living in what I came to think of as a bubble of hate and violence for all the hours in the day for a sustained period is very disconcerting, like the effect on all of us. And so much so that, you know, in closing, I did say to the jury, you know, please don't allow yourself to be desensitized as you deliberate, even though we've been here day in and day out, because we felt it. You know, we knew that the first time we heard Richard Spencer go on an unhinged rant, you know, extremely racist and terrible, it was like shocking. But then, you know, we played that in opening. We played it during his cross-examination, and then he got up and played it. And so, you know, we said to the jury, well, why do you think he's playing that for you? Does he think you haven't heard it enough? No, it's a strategy. And very surprisingly, one of the defense lawyers actually admitted to a reporter after the trial that that was their strategy, to desensitize the jury. But much as we could see it was a strategy, we also felt ourselves affected. And in fact, when I came home and I was ready to give a talk about this, and I realized I can't go out in the world and say the things that were said in this courtroom, describing it like that, you know, because it's not, you know, how we speak in our, you know, normal universe, but in our little bubble for so long, that was how everybody spoke, because for Robbie and me and our colleagues to put on the evidence, to do the cross-examinations, to do the jury addresses, we had to say all of these things. So that is really disconcerting, like how quickly, I mean, we were there for a month, which is kind of a long time in some respects, but not that long to feel, you know, to really feel it. And, you know, I think a lot of members of the trial team had nightmares, couldn't sleep, were really distressed by the images that we saw all day, the constant violence. So that was I think that you can't really anticipate what that's going to be like, even as you litigate, you know, hearings and motions for 4 years up to trial. The second thing that I found very surprising, or not very surprising, we knew that this was meticulously planned, but it was like everywhere you looked was more evidence of brazen intentionality. So as Robbie said, we had evidence from the defendants that they were going to publicly call this Unite the Right and privately call it the Battle of Charlottesville. And I began the cross-examination of the lead organizer with 2 posts that he made, which to me were like an open and shut case. One of the posts, he said, let's get bring everyone together, us and the people who oppose us, and we'll fight this shit out in the streets in the Battle of Charlottesville. And he posted that to the entire alt-right. So he's saying, I am going to plan an extremely violent event. The intention is to do violence in the Battle of Charlottesville on the weekend of August 11th and 12th. The day before he posts this, he, to the same server, everybody in the alt-right server, he says, the alt-right is a dangerous movement. And in order to maintain its energy and its motivation, it relies on racism. He says this overtly. So he is now, in 2 successive days, in only 2 posts, planned an event to do racially motivated violence on purpose with all the alt-right who would show up. Now, that is an extremely brazen thing to do that you would probably only do if you thought these chats would never become public, which they for sure did not. But that was not unusual to like turn over rocks and find evidence like that. I mean, that is how purposeful and intentional and planned this was.
I'm going to turn in just a minute to the amazing questions that people are putting in the Q&A. But Amy, I want to just give you a second to tell folks who sort of are like, okay, we did that. What next? How do we help? How do we sort of carry forth what was a massive triumph going forward? So can you give us just a sense of what else, what next, how to help? Like, what are our marching orders?
Yeah. Look, there's, as we've been talking about for the last, 40 minutes or so, clearly Charlottesville was a flashpoint in the rise of extremism. But as we prepare to mark the January 6th anniversary, it's not an isolated incident. There is so much work ahead. What has been heartening for us, especially in the last year, is how our case really has emerged as a model. And so I know there are a lot of questions that folks have been asking about, does this legal theory apply to January 6th? It's been alluded to. The upshot is it does, and it has already. Many, including the DC Attorney General, who just brought a lawsuit a few weeks ago against the Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and a number of individuals, specifically cited our lawsuit in creating, quote, momentum for cases like that. And while there is so much work we need to do in terms of both civil litigation against extremism and more broadly, this whole of society approach that we need, governmental action, resilience, education, de-radicalization, social media companies living up to their ethical obligations, and so much more. What is very clear is that civil litigation can play a crucial role. And I think this case proved that, not just in deterring extremism on the front end, having very real financial and operational impacts on the defendants, as we've seen time and again in this case, but in creating a model for accountability more broadly. And that has just been, for me, one of the most heartening parts of this work, to see that the legacy of this case has lived on. And I specifically, in addition to Robbie and Karen's brilliant work leading the legal team, want to shout out a few other folks and the entire team: Alan Levine at Cooley, David Mills, Mike Block, and Jess Phillips, and the entire incredible legal team getting to be there for those 4 weeks of trial and the additional weeks we were there physically in person, and see how this team meticulously managed this case, despite how difficult it was personally and professionally, was just truly extraordinary. In addition to our plaintiffs, who chose to relive the worst moments of their lives to hold accountable those responsible. And we haven't even touched on so much of the other incredible folks who are part of this, including our expert witnesses, Pete Semian, Kathy Blee, and Deborah Lipstadt, and so many people I would love to shout out if we had all the time, but I didn't want to be remiss in not mentioning those specific folks and our whole team by name. And in terms of what folks can do, stay engaged. So certainly there's post-trial motions that are happening in our case. Folks have seen the emails from IFA, and that we still are dealing with the expenses that come with cases like this, security and other things, and folks have been incredibly supportive, and for that we are grateful. And we are going to, of course, make sure that these judgments, once we have the final amounts that these defendants owe, once the post-trial motions are done, we are committed to making sure that those judgments are collected, and IFA is committed to supporting the plaintiffs in doing that. And I think more broadly, we are dealing with a crisis of extremism in this country, and all of us have an obligation to keep raising our voices through organizations like IFA, where you can support tangible action, but also in so many other ways, and holding our elected officials to account, and making sure that everything that needs to happen, that whole of society approach I mentioned and that Eric has talked about and is doing extraordinary work on, that we are not being so myopic we're losing sight of the broader needs here.
Karen and Robbie, so many questions in the Q&A, like shocking number about collecting these judgments, and a real fear that these are not defendants who are going to joyfully pay up. And I wondered if either of you, I'm sure that's the question you're asked above all things, is do you really have high hopes of collecting? And was that the point? And going forward, just I think a lot of sense that, are you content to say this was a moral victory and maybe never collect a dime?
Speaking for myself, the answer to that last question, Dahlia, is a very loud and strong no. I began my career, believe it or not, at Karen's current firm on a judgment collection case. So it was a little bit of time ago, but I learned how to do it, and I can refresh myself now, and our team will do the same. But the law has actually very strong mechanisms that can be used to collect judgments, which are, enforceable in any state in the country. And they include things like putting liens on people's homes, garnishing their wages, getting, probably most importantly, discovery into what assets they have and what they own and where their money is coming from. And once the judgments are finalized in this case, which they will be, we intend to use every single one of those techniques and methods to pursue the judgments against these defendants. Do I think that we'll collect every penny of $26 million? No, we probably won't do that. But we will collect a substantial part of it. And for these defendants, the numbers that we will collect will be huge. And that is the point. The point is that the amounts of money that we collect here should be a deterrent to anyone else who's thinking of organizing something like this going forward, to know that we will come after you too, and we will try to take your house, and we'll try to garnish your wages. So I am confident that we will get a substantial amount. Some of these individuals have assets or have substantial ability to earn money. Chris Cantwell's podcast, I think, financially was a success. Richard Spencer has the ability to make money continuing to speak and to kind of propagate his propaganda. And we will follow them for many years, making sure that we collect every penny we possibly can.
Karen, I don't know if you want to respond to that, or maybe I'll give you a choice. You can either amplify what Robbie just said, or there's some really thoughtful questions in the Q&A sort of making the point. One iteration is, we don't have 4 years to prove what happened on January 6th at the Capitol. We're only sort of beginning a process that took you a very long time, with a much, much bigger pool and more groups. And what are you, I think the question, the sort of nut of the question is, this is a make or break moment for accountability based on what happened a year ago tomorrow. What lessons can be derived from what you all took from Charlottesville that can be applied in a way that really could make profound difference in terms of accountability for January 6th, not in 3 years, but now?
Yeah, so fantastic question. One thing is that our trial was delayed due to COVID and other things that, the courts are functioning now, they're functioning in person. We had an in-person trial. So there are a lot of things that happened in our case that are not going to hold up the other litigations. We got civil sanctions, huge shout out to my partner, Jessica Phillips, who secured these amazing civil sanctions against some of the defendants, including jail time and financial penalties, which is very rare in a civil case. I don't think every case is going to, that will have to happen, because I do think our case lays a marker for how, the defendants need to cooperate better. Otherwise, they will suffer severe sanctions that will harm them at trial. So I do think the case that we litigated will help, because it's sort of set a precedent to be a point of leverage in these other cases. Also, as everybody knows, we do have a different Justice Department now, and there are many criminal cases that are in train. And now, I used to be a federal prosecutor, and the tools at your disposal when you are a prosecutor for the government are fantastic. I mean, you have immense power that you exercise with great responsibility, that, we as civil lawyers didn't have that. So I actually think, just to pat ourselves on the back a little bit, it's amazing that we got the result that we did in a civil case. And I do think these monetary penalties are going to be a huge punishment and a huge deterrent. But things do move more quickly if you have criminal authority behind you. And the other thing, of course, that's happening is the January 6th Commission, which has already collected an immense amount of evidence that's going to be made public. So I did see somebody in the chat ask, how do we not lose hope? And I think, as far as if you care about accountability, which presumably is why you're here, I think there is reason to be extremely hopeful, not just for the results, but for the pace of what's going to happen in these other litigations. The other thing that I would say on the point of hope in general, and sort of responsive to Dahlia's excellent question, is this was really a case where the people who we sued are people who are trying to dismantle the institutions that are the bedrock of our society and our democracy. And it was very, satisfying to me, and an enormous relief, and I know Robbie feels the same, as people who have sort of dedicated ourselves to the law, to see that an antidote to what had happened was found in our same institutions, was found in a court of law, and was found within the jury system, where these jurors from completely different backgrounds, political and otherwise, came together and rendered this judgment saying, there is not a place for this here. They awarded punitive damages. The entire point of that is to send a message beyond the particular defendants to others to say, do not do this. And they were very specific about the amount of damages. I mean, they took a lot of time to figure out those numbers. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be hopeful. And to me, I find a lot of hope, in our institutions, which remain strong.
Karen, there's a question in the Q&A that is directed at you, and it's something I know you and I have talked about in prior events, but I think there's at least one person watching who feels that the definition of conspiracy that you laid out is so very, very broad that it gives them a little bit of a chill. I think there's two parts to the question. One, can that very, very broad definition of conspiracy, wherein I don't even have to know that I was part of it, I just, was a tiny cog in a wheel, be used against our side in a way that is kind of dangerous going forward? And what is the constraint on that? I think there's just a feeling that, and you and I have talked about it in the context of speech before, because I think it does edge up on First Amendment questions. And so I wonder if you can just mollify folks who are watching who think that you just opened kind of a Pandora's box wherein we're all liable for the worst conduct of other people.
Yeah, so to be a member of a conspiracy, you have to have made an agreement. It doesn't have to be an express or formal agreement, but there does have to be some indicia of an agreement to do something of an unlawful purpose. And so I do think that juries hold civil litigators and prosecutors to that burden of showing that there was a common joint unlawful purpose and that there was an agreement. So I don't think people need to worry, like, if you're not going out into the world to commit, unlawful acts with others, I think you're okay. But what I think is undeniable, and also speaks to the First Amendment issue, is that violence is not First Amendment protected activity. Conspiracy to do violence and conspiracy to create a violent, battle in the streets of an American city, that is not protected conduct. And so if you came there and somebody can prove that you agreed to be there to commit a violent act, you are part of the conspiracy. And that doesn't matter, if you joined at the beginning or you joined in the middle or you joined at the end. So, but I do think that's a very special thing. I mean, you really have to have an common unlawful purpose with your co-conspirators. So don't panic.
Robbie, there's a lot of questions in the chat about why this had to be a civil case, why this was not a criminal matter, and a lot of, I think, just sort of generalized frustration that whatever all else happens, folks are not going to jail.
Let me be candid in saying I share that frustration. One of the reasons we brought this case when we did is because I was convinced that the then Department of Justice, led by Jeff Sessions, was not going to pursue the kind of criminal cases that I thought they should pursue, and frankly, the kind of criminal cases that we're now seeing out of the DOJ in connection with January 6th. Criminal prosecution would have been a better outcome, but I don't wear a prosecutor's hat, and I certainly didn't wear a prosecutor's hat in August 2017. So the methods that I had, the remedies that I had available to me and to our clients was a civil case in getting civil damages or monetary damages. That all hope is not lost there. Let me just say that. The statute of limitations have not run. And it is still entirely possible that at least some aspects of what happened in Charlottesville will get criminally prosecuted. I very much hope that happens, in part sparked by, frankly, by our trial. Normally, the criminal case happens first. This will be kind of a reverse order where hopefully the criminal cases will follow the civil case.
I think before I turn it over to Amy to finish up, I wondered if both Karen and Robbie have something to say. We keep kind of toggling back to January 6th and lessons learned. And I wonder if each of you can just offer sort of a closing thought about how you think about what folks need to do starting tomorrow to commemorate and memorialize tomorrow, to make it have meaning and purpose and not just a sense of sort of nihilism and hopelessness and despair. Karen, maybe you want to go first?
Sure. I think that the groups of people who were involved in Charlottesville and in Berkeley and at the Capitol are still like a very small universe of people in this country. I believe that very strongly. And I believe that there are people of all political persuasions and backgrounds who don't want to live in a world of lawlessness and chaos and violence that we saw on the grounds of the Capitol a year ago. And I think that, January 6th has appropriately gotten so much attention that if we do this properly, it can end up stemming an otherwise very frightening tide. But, my personal view is that, and I expect, we'll hear this tomorrow, and already it's a sense out there. I mean, we really are at an inflection point. The events of January 6th will either be viewed as, an acceleration of a trend that is already happening that was very dangerous, or it will be viewed as the time when everybody of good faith came together and said, we need to stop this. This is not what America is about. And I know, after our verdict, I heard from a lot of people, I know Robbie and Amy did too, from all across the country, not just Democrats, not just Republicans, just people who were grateful for this verdict. And so I do think America will do what America always does, which is vote on the side of democracy. I think that's what will happen. I hope that's what will happen.
That's enormously helpful. How about you, Robbie? Just a quick thought on how you are looking at tomorrow based on what happened this year.
So, of course, I agree with Karen. I mean, I think we have to fight back for our democracy in a way that I don't think many of us ever contemplated would happen. I think it's a fight that is entirely winnable and that we will win. And we saw that, at least in part, as a result of, in the Charlottesville verdicts. But it's a fight, and we all have to continue to fight it. And it's not just by bringing cases like this, which are so important, and which we have to keep bringing, but in fighting for our democracy, fighting for laws that will uphold our democracy, fighting for candidates and judges who will uphold our democracy, and making it clear that these noxious ideas like replacement theory are completely and totally unacceptable and are wrong and untrue, and to teach our children, I feel like I'm a Crosby, Stills and Nash song, but to teach our children that they are wrong and totally unacceptable. And all of that has to be done. There's no one thing, but we need to get back to a country with a common, we can argue about tax policy or legal claims in various ways all we want, but we all have to agree on democracy, and that's what we have to get our country back to.
So I just want to say what an honor. It is always an honor to be, even in Zoom boxes, with this phenomenal team, and just how delighted I am to be with you. And I'm going to turn it over to Amy to bring us home.
Thank you so much, Dahlia and Robbie and Karen and Eric. And I think it is very easy in this moment to feel scared and hopeless, but we hope that tonight and this case, this verdict, gives everyone that little bit of hope that I think we all need in going into the January 6th anniversary as we think about what this country is, how we protect our democracy, how we fight for our democracy, the lessons we learned during this 4-week trial in Charlottesville, the example, the model that this case has created and in fact already served in certain ways in paving a path forward. That makes clear that we are not powerless in a moment when it can so easily feel that way. And for me, it has been an incredible honor to get to be a part of this. And I know that's true of Robbie and Karen and the whole team, because of not just the importance of supporting these incredible plaintiffs and seeing their victory through in Charlottesville, but because of what this case has meant in the broader fight for our democracy at a moment when it's so crucial. And I also want to make clear that we truly could not have done it without each and every one of you who is on this call tonight, and the thousands and thousands of other people around the country who have supported this effort with your donations, with your moral support, your kind words, the countless Zoom calls, webinars, and even in-person events when those were still happening at one point, that truly made this case possible in so many ways. So really thank you to all of you, not just for being here tonight, but for everything you've done over the last 4 years to make this case possible. The work continues tomorrow. There's so much of it to do, but I hope that everyone here tonight can feel proud for the part you played in this important fight to protect our democracy, to stand up for our values, and to make clear that violent extremism has no place in this country. So thank you to all of you, to Dahlia, Eric, Robbie, Karen again, and I'm sure we will see all of you soon. Have a great night.